Hi, students. This is Minji again, and today we are joined by the president of the Florida Housing Coalition, Jaimie Ross, and she has graciously offered her time to share her experience and expertise in the field of fighting for state-level affordable housing trust fund, the Sadowski Fund in Florida. So just to put this particular interview in context, we've learned through the previous two lectures of this week that how difficult it is to actually get affordable housing built when you only rely on municipal compliance. So the fair share approach, or the builder's remedy that is provided in the fair share approach is it acts as sanctions, and there are reporting requirements, compliance expectations, but still that doesn't get to actual production of affordable housing. So we see the Housing Trust Fund as a different model, though an alternative model for implementing housing goals, which is actually providing direct monetary subsidy to build affordable housing. And Jaimie has been instrumental in getting the Florida's Sadowski Fund Housing Trust Fund established. So we are really fortunate to have Jaimie here, and I would love it if we can get started with learning more about the process and the experience that Jaimie has gone through. So thank you for joining today.
My pleasure.
Jaimie. And can you please enlighten us or walk us through the history, how the coalition first came together, who are the key interest groups, and how you put them together?
Yeah. And I'd like to actually start a little bit before that with the why. Florida has a housing element requirement, a comprehensive plan requirement that has mandatory elements, and one of those is a housing element. And if you look at the statute, you'll see that it's a pretty robust requirement to provide for housing for the entire and the current population and the anticipated population, including really low-income people, special needs, farm workers are expressly stated in the statute. So local governments in Florida have had that requirement for a long time. And what we heard from local governments, what they would say about that is it was an unfunded mandate. So they had a mandate to provide for affordable housing, but they didn't have any funding to do it, right? Mm-hmm. So the Sadowski Act, William E. Sadowski Affordable Housing Act that passed in 1992, was to make that mandate funded, to fund that mandate, right? And so part of passing the act and the lobbying through the halls of the legislature for that, one of our talking points was that this was going to provide the funding for the housing element for the comprehensive plan. There was also talking points from the home builders who were part of this effort that housing equals jobs. In fact, we had buttons that we wore, these big buttons that said housing equals jobs. So the Sadowski Coalition that was able to get this act passed in 1992 was made up of 11 statewide groups. And what my claim to fame is that I brought these folks together, but here's the deal. I don't get any credit for it. The reason I brought them together is because I didn't know anything. I just had moved to Tallahassee. I was fairly young, inexperienced, and I had no idea these groups didn't like each other. So I was making phone calls. This is like before email, you guys, okay? Life before email. I'm like making phone calls and get the realtors and the home builders, and they kind of got along, but then local governments and home builders, no. And then some faith-based groups and legal services. So all these groups that really never agreed on anything, right? So that was really the secret sauce, I think, to getting the act passed and getting this dedicated revenue source was that we spoke with one voice. And I'll tell you, the Florida legislature was just bowled over. I mean, I can remember legislators saying, naming the person from the home builder and saying, you like this just like it is? Yes, sir. And then local government, you like this just like it is? Yes, sir. And they would just like laugh. How could we not vote for this? if these groups who never agree on anything agree that they want this. And how did that happen? Because I called them together, again, not knowing any of this baggage, and sat down, everybody rolled up their sleeves and started to compromise. So nobody got everything they wanted, nobody, but everybody got something that they needed. Okay. So we talked, first of all, what should the source of funding be? Well, we decided that it should be the increase in the documentary stamp tax. Now, in some states, that's called a transfer tax. It's paid whenever you record a deed. Should it just be on residential? We said, no, let's have it on everything. It's going to be on residential property. It's going to be on commercial property. How much should we increase it? We wanted to increase it by 20 cents. Well, we were only going to be able to do a dime in 1992, but we bring the other dime in 1995. So actually, that is what happened in the act. And we said, okay, well, what's going to be done with this money? What's going to be done with this money? Well, a portion of it's going to go to the State Housing Finance Agency for their rental program. They had already developed this wonderful rental program called SALE, which created gap financing to allow apartments to be built using bonds. They didn't work financially without that additional revenue. They didn't pencil out. So now there would be a source of funding at the state level for that. That was the smaller of the programs. 70% of the money was for a brand newly created program in the bill that created the dedicated revenue source. It also created a program that never existed prior to that time. It was called SHIP. The State Housing Initiatives Partnership Program was to be administered locally. By whom? Should it just be for the large cities? When we're sitting and we're negotiating this thing, let's make sure that every county, and we have 67 counties in Florida, let's make sure that every county gets some of this money so that every legislator cares about it,
Right.
Even if they're in a rural community. Well, a rural community may have very low population. Well, let's make a minimum amount. And at that time, we said 250,000. So even if your population doesn't warrant getting $250,000 a year, you're going to get 250,000. So we get the buy-in from every legislator in the state. It's going to have something for their community from this. Right. So it was really, I think, smartly put together with all of these compromises, right? The realtors wanted all the money to go for home ownership. Legal services and other low-income advocates wanted it to go for rental. So compromises were reached. Right. 65% of the SHIP money goes for home ownership. It was not based on data. It was based on political compromise, truly. So the fact is the housing need was severe and it was nothing like it is now. The housing need, of course, is so much more severe. So all of that money is oversubscribed, right? So that's how the act got put together. It passed in 1992. And for the first 10 years of the program, all the money that came in was appropriated out according to the formula that I described. Right. Every county got the money based on the population formula and entitlement cities. So those are larger cities, like in Tallahassee, Leon County would get a share because they're a county. Tallahassee would get a share because there's a large city. In fact, larger population than the county. Gainesville is that way, but most every place else, the county gets more than the entitlement cities. And so that's what happened for the first 10 years of the program. And Minji, do you want me to go into what happened and
sure.
After that?
Before we get into what has happened very recently, what I think I was curious to know whether there were any major challenges that you faced, other than the fact that you had to bring, sort of disparate interests together. Were there, sticking points or, any major challenges that you had to overcome in the early years?
Yes. In the early years, I just talked to you about the formula for the money. The home builders, when I said everybody got something that they needed, right? They didn't get everything they wanted, but they all got what they needed. The home builders wanted a set aside of that 75% of the money would be used for construction related activities, and they got that, but they wanted something else. They wanted regulatory reform. They wanted every local government that got SHIP money to expedite permits because they felt like local governments were part of the problem in affordable housing because it was so slow to get permits. So they wanted a mandate that you had to expedite permits if you were going to get SHIP money. And they also wanted you to have an ongoing process as a local government of review of everything that you're going to do. Like you're going to have a new land development regulation, you're going to amend the comp plan. They wanted to have some kind of like an economic impact statement, like a housing impact. Like, what is this going to do to the cost of housing? Not that you couldn't go ahead and enact that change as a local government, but to be cognizant that when you are doing what you're doing, you're going to increase the cost of housing. You're making it more difficult to produce housing. Those two things were put into the original law. What happened was the home builders came back to me and said, they're not doing it.
Mhm.
They're not doing it. And you know what? They're only expediting the building permit. That's the only permit that they're expediting. And so as the facilitator of the Sadowski Coalition, I saw it as my job to keep the promises, to make sure the promises were kept. And the intent was not just the building permit, okay? So maybe we didn't draft it carefully enough. So I went back and did an amendment to the statute to define permit by referring back to some land use growth management laws that were, it means everything. I mean, you go for a variance, you know, a change in land, whatever it is, that has to be expedited. And then we do trainings. My organization, the Florida Housing Coalition, our business is training and technical assistance. When I initiated the Sadowski Coalition, I actually wasn't with the Florida Housing Coalition. I was with 1,000 Friends of Florida and very much doing legal advocacy work. I was a lawyer there. So but the Florida Housing Coalition's work is training and technical assistance. So the Florida Housing Coalition would also, to make things go smoothly, like do all kinds of workshops on regulatory reform, right? So in answer to your question, that was a sticking point for us. That was a hard one. And I can't say that it's working perfectly now. In fact, the Florida legislature a couple years ago, it had nothing to do with us, amended the part of the statute that talks about what's called affordable housing advisory committees, which it was in the original act to have an affordable housing advisory committee and to review regulations and to have what was called an incentive plan to reform regulations. The legislature a couple of years ago amended the statute to require that at least one elected official, or not at least, but that one elected official serve on the AHAC in all the SHIP communities. And they did that in part because this regulatory reform part just hasn't happened to the extent that it was intended to happen.
Right. Well, thank you for that. I hadn't known about the permitting challenges. And now, sort of moving on to more recent years, the students are not going to be too familiar with the fund and the mechanics and the details. But there will be an accompanying short lecture that I'll be delivering up front to give some of the basic materials or the framework. But to cut it short, the fund has been subject to what's called the sweeping, and that's been a huge issue for years. And can you tell us about the sweeping? What it is and what has been your role in making sure to protect the fund so that the housing programs are funded every year?
Yes. So the act passed in 1992. We never lobbied at all after the act passed. It was like, okay, that's done. And that it was for the first 10 years, right? From 1992 to 2002. In 2002, when Jeb Bush was the governor, we were having a housing boom, meaning the housing prices had really gone up. And so the amount of money that was being collected, the doc stamp money really went up. Right. And it was like around 400,000. And it's like, the governor's office and maybe, staff and appropriations are like, look at this big pot of money. And they never expected to have that much money. And we could use this money for whatever. This
Right.
could be like a slush fund. And so it was like, what? They didn't understand the nexus. Why did we choose the documentary stamp tax as being our dedicated revenue source back in 1992? We looked at different sources. We didn't just start with a doc stamp.
Mm-hmm.
The reason we chose the doc stamp as the revenue source is because of the nexus between the cost of housing and the need for subsidy.
Mm-hmm.
So the doc stamp is paid on all of your deeds that get recorded. And the money's deposited, when it's paid for when you record the deed locally in the clerk's office, and then by operation of law, it goes into the state and local housing trust funds. And when real estate prices are high, you got a hot real estate market, you got a lot of doc stamps being collected, right? And when real estate markets are high, it's a hot real estate market, prices are high, you need more subsidy to get people into home ownership, right? It's like, well, you could have had $3,000 in down payment assistance to help you out in a cool market, but in a hot market, you may need $30,000 in South Florida, to get into home ownership. So there was a direct nexus. I don't think that the legislature really understood that. There was always this talk about, oh, we never expected there to be that much money. And that really isn't true. Nonetheless, once they got the taste of being able to go into, because they want to raise taxes, right? The legislature does not want to raise taxes. This was actually, we never called it an increase in taxes. But once it got swept, let me tell you, the home builders said, well, now it's a tax. Before we considered a user fee because it was coming back to our industry. It was being, collected from our industry, but it was going back to our industry. Now that it's collected on the backs of our industry, but it's going God knows where, now it's really a tax. But they weren't going to repeal it. They were going to continue using. Once they started, they never stopped. So the number is so extraordinary. From 2002 until last year, into the 2021 legislative session, it's probably close to $3 billion that the legislature has swept from the housing trust funds to, again, God knows where. In other words, you can't, sometimes reporters will ask me, well, what did they use it for? Neither I nor anyone else can tell you what they used it for. It just went into what we call general revenue. That's just sort of a nebulous, the coffers of the state. Could have been used for an orchid event. It could have been used for anything that the legislature appropriated money for. Okay, so that's what happened, and I have to say, and I think your students should know, because they're working in a world where we have an extreme housing crisis. And I think it's important to know that housing crisis is in no small part due to the sweeping of the trust funds. Look how much housing would have been built, and it's not to say that Florida would have no housing crisis at all had it not been swept. The fact is, virtually every state has a housing crisis that is a desirable state, that's a desirable place to live, because housing is a commodity, a speculative commodity that people use to make profit. And so we always have that, we always have that strain or that tension between, but housing is something that everybody needs. Like, isn't it a human right? But housing, we have a capitalist economy, and we use land to make profits. So we always have that tension, right? But yeah, the sweeping of those trust funds was a really bad thing. What happened in the last legislative session is quite remarkable, because one of the things, of course, we've been doing as advocates, and although I'm the person who brought the Sadowski Coalition together, back in 1991. I am not the person who is key for keeping the housing trust fund being totally swept or even eliminated. There were years when the legislature was trying to eliminate. There was when there was a sort of a deal struck with Governor Bush that when the year after he left office, that there would be a cap put on the trust funds. It was really the Florida Realtors more than any other of the Sadowski Coalition members that made sure, one, we never lost the trust funds, two, we got the cap removed from the trust funds. They've really been the most effective advocate for keeping the Sadowski trust funds. But so what we've been doing over the last few years, we found some Republican leaders who were willing to sponsor a bill to stop the sweeps. Because in our Florida legislature, it is completely Republican controlled. So if it's a Democrat bill, it's not going to get heard. Okay, so we found Republican sponsors, and we do quite well on the Senate side. On the House side, it would never even get out of a first committee. But they knew that we were desperate to stop the sweeps. So in the last legislative session, the Speaker of the House and the Senate President, in really an unprecedented move, came out and announced together that they had reached a deal, and this was early in the session, that they would put a stop to the sweeps. And they would do that after they took 50%. First, it was 2/3, but we got it changed to 50. After they would take 50% of the money and divert it to two other trust funds permanently. Those two trust funds, one was a wastewater, basically it's like getting off a septic and onto sewer. And the other one was a sea level rise, like a resiliency program. And they felt that both of those programs were related to affordable housing. And they wanted to fund those programs. And so they said, okay, we're going to fund these programs. We're going to permanently sweep. So these programs will permanently get that Sadowski Trust Fund money going forward, not just in 2021, but going forward. And the Sadowski Trust Funds will permanently be half of what they are, but there will be no more sweeps. So this will be recurring revenue that the local government SHIP administrators and housing advocates and can all rely upon getting. Right. And we'll always have the growth. If the market goes down, doc stamps are down, then our money will be down. If the market goes up, doc stamps are up, then our money is up.
Right.
So last year, it was $209 million that was appropriated for the Sadowski State and Local Housing Trust Funds. That was after the 50% sweep. 50% what was left was $209 million. If you would look at the history of sweeps, this is really sad to say, but that's more money than we gotten in the last 12 years. Okay. Right. So what that tells you is we were losing more than half our money over the last 12 years to sweeps. Okay. Now, because the revenue estimates are so good coming into this fiscal year, which is 22-23, we are looking at $355 million in Sadowski State and Local Housing Trust Fund money. So it's a huge amount of money, and we need it desperately. In fact, we need more than it because of almost $3 billion in sweeps, right?
Right.
But here's the good news: it won't be swept. There's a promise made. We expect that promise to be kept, and the fiscal year 22-23, there will be an appropriation of over $350 million for the state and local housing trust funds.
Well, that's great to hear that the coalition has, scored this victory, somewhat of a sad victory, if you could say that, in your sort of fight to protect the trust fund for affordable housing. But I'm sure you also get this question that, what is to prevent the legislature from, rewriting the bill and, introducing a new act that would reduce or somewhat diminish the revenue?
You're right for asking that question. I mean, and you're right that people ask that question. So the folks who are in leadership right now, the current Speaker and President of the Senate, the incoming Speaker and President of the Senate, they're going to keep that promise because they were part of making that promise. When they're all gone, which you can probably say is 4 to 6 years from now, then I do think that, it could be going back to, we want it to go back the way it was.
Mhm. Right.
Or, I mean, in other words, it can work both ways, right? So
Right.
it may, yes. So the answer to the question is that legally, they
Mhm.
cannot bind future legislatures.
Right. Right. Which highlights the point of being constantly engaged with the political
Yeah.
process to make sure that the promises are delivered and that there is sufficient, or not sufficient, but revenue sources for affordable housing.
You're right. And that's a good reason for you covering this with your students,
Mhm.
because I'm getting very tired of doing. We need young people to get involved in this
Mhm.
advocacy.
Mhm.
Yes.
Mhm. That's great to hear. We had another interview from a California's legislative aide who spoke about the need for young professionals to get into and
Yes.
be, involved in this legislative process, because typically it's not. And you have the same number of group of people working at the with the legislators, and there's not enough fresh voice in.
That's true. And in Florida, it's really easy for young people to break into this because of term limits.
Mm,
So let's say somebody has been a lobbyist and been around forever. It's not like they've got these great relationships, that go back years and years and years because of term limits. We
mhm,
have so many new legislators coming in all the time, especially, in the House. I mean, it's like they arrive and then they're in leadership. So, it's easy for a person to break into this.
Okay, no, that's great. And I think this is a great segue to sort of ask you this last question that I have
Mhm.
prepared for you. So since the students taking this class in different places, locations, we're all working to develop realistic solutions, either local housing, local ordinance amendments, or state bills, legislative bills. We're all working on local and state level solutions in our context to advance affordable housing issue and create inclusive communities and combat exclusionary zoning. So with that in mind, do you have any advice for students working in their local context?
Yeah, every local context, of course, is different. So you got to know where you're working. So, I mean, some of my closest colleagues are working in parts of the nation that are politically nothing like Florida.
Mhm.
And so, for instance, in their more progressive states, they're talking about housing as a human right. They're demanding, not asking. They're demanding for, really large sums of money to be put into affordable housing. And they're making great headway. You need to know the politics in your community. I will tell you that housing is not a partisan issue in Florida, any place other than at the state capitol.
Mhm.
I work with local governments throughout Florida who are solidly red politically, and they all know how important affordable housing is. I don't have to sell them on it.
Mm.
They all know how important it is. It's only in Tallahassee, getting back to that first part of our conversation, because they see this big pot of money and they want it. Okay.
Right.
But really, even in the most conservative states, I think there is a real understanding from the business community how important affordable housing is. So people may be coming from different places. One person may really, be devoting their lives to affordable housing because of social justice. And another person may be just a real stalwart on advocate for housing because they see that the economy is going to fail,
Mhm.
if there's inadequate housing, and that employers can't recruit workforce and so on. So my advice would be to understand the community that you're working in and choose solutions that would be palatable for that community.
Mhm.
So,
Right.
you
No,
know, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, no, I was just going to say that's a great advice, because part of the outcome of this project, this class, is actually to come up with a playbook that could get through the political process of getting either a bill through or local ordinance amendment through. And I think what's really important in that process is really learning to work with people who have different perspectives
Yes,
from you. Yeah.
that is very important. And I guess I learned that early on with putting together the Sadowski Coalition.
Mhm.
You know, there were 11 different groups, and they all had different reasons for wanting to support affordable housing. And of course, now the Sadowski Coalition is 32 groups, statewide groups, and thousands of local groups. And yeah, people have different drivers, and it's important for you to, to be respectful of why everybody is there and to work together towards solutions. But at the same time, sometimes I think housing advocates are just too timid. And what we really need to be doing, no matter where we are in the country or in a state or in a local community, is not be bashful about saying that affordable housing needs to be a priority.
Mhm.
That it's not to get the crumbs that are left over after everything else gets funded, that it needs to be a priority, that affordable housing needs to be viewed akin to infrastructure, that it is an absolute necessity that every community have adequate housing, that people are not homeless. That should be a minimum, that nobody should be homeless. And it's not like we don't have resources. We are a resourceful country, and it's a matter of priorities.
Mhm.
So, dig into your budgets. And we've been seeing that actually because of the great work that some faith-based
Mhm.
grassroots groups have been doing around Florida. We have local government trust funds now for affordable housing being funded to the tune of $10 million. So it's like, we're not going to hear no for an answer. They're getting in local government elected officials' faces, and they're saying we're just not going to take it anymore.
Right.
We need this to be a priority. And I think that's really important.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, thank you for sharing your wonderful expertise and all the experience and your time. I really appreciate the historical sort of origins of learning about the origins of the trust fund and all the battles that you have sort of fought throughout the 20 years of the trust fund. I really want to thank you, Jaimie, for engaging with us today.
Well, let me tell you, it's I who thanks you. I thank you for your brilliance and the fact that you moved to Tallahassee, that we have access to you, that you put together articles for us and you put in our conferences the most important concept there is, which is of land value creation and land value capture. These are critical. Having someone like you, I know I'm a little biased, graduate of MIT, who is doing this work and teaching people about this work. I owe you a great debt. Thank you, Minji Kim.
Thank you, Jaimie.